Jim was in the middle of Light My Fire when he locked eyes with Ed Sullivan and sang the forbidden word anyway. What happened next left 728 people inside CBS Studio 50 in complete silence. September 17, 1967. The studio air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. The Doors had already performed People Are Strange flawlessly. But Sullivan's team had one demand: change the lyric "Girl, we couldn't get much higher" to something, anything else. Morrison agreed. He lied. But what none of them knew was that two men in dark suits were sitting in the control room, taking notes. FBI agents, monitoring Morrison for the past 6 months. In the third row, center section, sat a 19-year-old named Sarah Bergman. She'd driven 11 hours from Ohio, skipping her father's funeral to be there. Her brother David had died from an overdose 3 weeks earlier. This was her last attempt to find a reason to keep going. "His voice made me believe darkness could be beautiful," Sarah wrote in her diary that night. She didn't know Morrison had just destroyed his television career. She didn't know the FBI file on him had just grown thicker. She only knew that when he sang that forbidden word, higher, something inside her decided to stay alive. Sullivan banned the Doors forever. The FBI opened a formal investigation, and Sarah Bergman lived. Before we continue with what happened in those 47 minutes after the cameras stopped rolling, if you're fascinated by the untold stories behind rock and roll's most legendary moments, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The meeting had taken place 6 hours before showtime in Sullivan's private office on the 8th floor of CBS headquarters. Ray Manzarek sat rigid in a leather chair, while Robbie Krieger nervously tapped his fingers against his knee. John Densmore stared at the floor. And Jim Morrison stood by the window, looking down at Broadway, a half-empty bottle of bourbon already in his hand, at 3 in the afternoon. Sullivan's producer, Bob Precht, had been clear and surgical in his delivery. The lyric had to change. The word higher was a drug reference, and Ed Sullivan's show would not become a platform for narcotics advocacy. America's families trusted Ed Sullivan. That trust would not be broken for some long-haired kids from Los Angeles who thought they could rewrite the rules of television. Morrison had turned from the window then, his leather pants creaking as he moved, and smiled that slow, dangerous smile that would become his signature. He agreed. No problem. They would change it. Precht had relaxed visibly, shaking hands with Ray, confirming the 6 o'clock rehearsal time. But Ray Manzarek knew. He had seen that smile before, right before Morrison had exposed himself at a Miami club 2 years earlier, right before he had punched a promoter in Phoenix, right before every disaster that had followed them from San Francisco to New York. Ray grabbed Jim's arm in the hallway. Afterward, his fingers digging into Morrison's leather jacket, his voice low and urgent. "Don't do this. We need this exposure. We need Sullivan." But Morrison had just looked at him with those empty eyes, eyes that seemed to see through walls and into some darker dimension, and said something that Ray would repeat to reporters for the next 40 years. He said that if he couldn't sing his own words on national television, then maybe America deserved to choke on its own fear. The rehearsal at 6 had gone smoothly. Morrison sang higher as better, and Sullivan had watched from the wings, nodding approval, his arms crossed over his chest, in that familiar pose 70 million Americans recognized. The 2 FBI agents arrived during the dinner break. Nobody questioned them. They wore CBS visitor badges and carried clipboards, and positioned themselves in the control room behind the technical director, their eyes never leaving the monitors. Their presence had been authorized 3 weeks earlier, when FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover's office received a letter from a concerned parent in Indiana claiming that rock and roll music was being used to indoctrinate American youth into drug culture and sexual promiscuity. Morrison's name appeared on a list of 23 performers deemed worthy of observation. The doors were number 7. The agent's orders were simple: watch, record, report. If probable cause for federal drug charges emerged, they had arrest authority. One of them, a man named Richard Helm, who would later become deputy director of the FBI's Los Angeles field office, wrote in his official report that Morrison appeared intoxicated before the live broadcast, stumbling slightly as he walked to his position, his pupils dilated under the studio lights. The other agent, whose name remains redacted in the declassified files released in 2003, noted that Morrison consumed at least 4 ounces of whiskey in his dressing room during the 30-minute period before airtime. Neither agent recommended immediate action. They wanted to see what would happen when the cameras went live. At 9:07 Eastern Time, the Doors took their position on stage 4. 73 million people were watching at home. Ray's hands hovered over the Vox Continental organ keys. Robbie's fingers found the opening notes. John counted them in with a crisp hi-hat pattern. And Morrison leaned into the microphone, his eyes scanning the audience, landing briefly on Sarah Bergman in the 3rd row, then moving to the camera, then to Ed Sullivan standing in the wings, and then to something else. Something no one else could see. The first verse went perfectly. The second verse arrived. The forbidden lyric approached. Ray hit the organ progression and looked over at Jim, a silent prayer on his lips. And Morrison sang it. Girl, we couldn't get much higher. Not better, not lighter. Higher. The exact word they had promised to change. He didn't mumble it. He didn't soften it. He sang it, clearly, distinctly, his voice rising on the final syllable, his eyes locked on Sullivan's face, watching the old man's expression transform from satisfaction to confusion to rage in the span of 3 seconds. The song finished. The audience applauded. Morrison bowed slightly, that same dangerous smile playing at his lips. And Ed Sullivan walked off the set without a word. What happened in the next 47 minutes became the subject of rumor and speculation for decades. But the truth was documented in 3 separate sources. Ray Manzarek's unpublished diary entries from 1967, the FBI surveillance report filed on September 18th, and the testimony of a CBS stagehand named Tommy Mercer, who witnessed the entire confrontation and sold his story to Rolling Stone magazine in 1989 for $12,000. The cameras had stopped rolling. The audience was being ushered out, and Sullivan's office door slammed so hard that technicians on the floor below thought something had exploded. Morrison walked in first, still holding his microphone, his leather jacket dripping with sweat. Sullivan was behind his desk, his face purple, his finger pointing at Morrison like a loaded weapon. The other Doors members crowded into the doorway. Bob Precht stood beside Sullivan, his hand on the phone, ready to call security. And the 2 FBI agents positioned themselves near the back wall, their notepads open, recording every word. Sullivan spoke first, and his words were volcanic. He called Morrison a liar, a degenerate, a drug-addled hippie who had just committed career suicide on national television. He said the Doors would never work in television again, that he would personally contact every major network and every variety show producer in America to ensure they were blacklisted. He said Morrison was everything wrong with the younger generation, everything that was poisoning American values, everything that needed to be stamped out before it infected more impressionable minds. Morrison let him finish. Then he did something unexpected. He laughed. Not a nervous laugh or a defensive laugh, but a genuine, deep laugh that seemed to come from somewhere primal. And then he spoke, his voice calm and measured, his words chosen with the precision of the poet he claimed to be. He told Sullivan that the word higher wasn't about drugs. It was about transcendence, about breaking through the limitations of ordinary consciousness, about refusing to accept the prison of conventional thinking. He said that Sullivan's fear of a single word revealed more about Sullivan's generation than it did about his own. He said that in 50 years, nobody would remember Ed Sullivan's safe, comfortable variety show, but they would remember the Doors, because the Doors refused to compromise their art for anybody's fear. And then Morrison said the thing that would follow him to Paris and into that bathtub 4 years later. He said that Sullivan's world was dying, that the old rules were crumbling, that a new consciousness was emerging whether Sullivan liked it or not, and that Morrison himself was willing to die to make sure that emergence happened. The room went silent. Sullivan's face had moved from purple to white, and then he said the words that would become prophecy. He looked directly at Morrison and spoke slowly, each word deliberate. This boy will end up in prison or dead within 5 years. Mark my words, he has no respect for authority, no sense of consequence, no understanding that actions have prices. He will destroy himself, and you will all watch it happen. The FBI agents wrote faster. Bob Precht picked up the phone and told security to escort the Doors from the building. Ray tried to apologize, but Sullivan wouldn't look at him. And Morrison walked out of that office with the same expression he had worn, walking in, as if nothing had happened, as if he had just performed at a small club instead of committing professional suicide on the most watched television program in America. The agents followed them to the elevators, then to the street, then for 6 blocks until the Doors climbed into a taxi headed for their hotel. One agent returned to the CBS building to interview Sullivan. The other went to FBI headquarters to file his report. Both reports reached J. Edgar Hoover's desk by noon the following day. Hoover wrote a single sentence in the margin. Continue surveillance. Escalate to level 2 monitoring. By the end of the week, Morrison's file had expanded from 7 pages to 43. His phone was tapped. His mail was opened. His hotel rooms were searched. His associates were interviewed. And a plan was formed to build a federal case against him when the opportunity presented itself. That opportunity would come 18 months later in Miami. But Morrison didn't know about any of that yet. On the night of September 17, 1967, he sat in his hotel room at the Chelsea with Pamela Corson, drinking whiskey and reading Nietzsche, acting as if he hadn't just ended the Doors' television career. Ray came to the room around midnight, furious, demanding to know what Morrison had been thinking. And Morrison had looked up from his book with those empty eyes and said something that Ray remembered word for word decades later when Morrison was dead and Ray was trying to make sense of it all. Morrison said that he had made a choice in that moment on stage, a choice between survival and truth, between compromise and integrity, between living safely and dying free. He said he chose dying free. Ray didn't understand what that meant then. He understood it perfectly when he got the call from Paris on July 3, 1971. The ban was immediate and total. Ed Sullivan kept his promise. Within a week, every major television variety show in America had received a call from Sullivan's office. The Tonight Show, the Merv Griffin Show, the Dick Cavett Show, all of them passed on booking the Doors. Radio stations began pulling their singles. Concert promoters grew nervous, and the FBI file kept growing. By November 1967, Morrison was under active surveillance by 3 different federal agencies. By March 1968, there were credible discussions within the Justice Department about building an obscenity case. By March 1969, when Morrison exposed himself on stage in Miami, the pieces were already in place. The arrest took 90 minutes. The charges were filed by the end of the week, and Morrison was facing 6 felony counts that carried a maximum sentence of 11 years in prison. Ed Sullivan's prophecy was halfway fulfilled. Sarah Bergman never knew about any of this. She went back to Ohio the morning after the Sullivan Show and enrolled in art school at Kent State. She married in 1969, had 2 children, and worked as a high school art teacher for 37 years. She kept that diary entry from September 17, 1967, in a drawer beside her bed until she died in 2009 at the age of 61. Her daughter found it while cleaning out the house and posted it online, where it went viral among Doors fans who recognized the date and understood its significance. Sarah had written about how Morrison's voice had saved her life that night, how his refusal to change his words had shown her that integrity mattered more than approval, how watching him choose truth over safety had given her the courage to keep living. She never knew that her presence in the third row, her survival, her decision to stay alive was the only unqualified good thing to come out of that night. Morrison destroyed his career. Sullivan died angry. The FBI wasted resources. But Sarah lived, and maybe that was enough. Morrison died in Paris on July 3, 1971, at the age of 27, in a bathtub in an apartment on Rue Beautreillis. No autopsy was performed. The official cause was listed as heart failure. Pamela Corson, who found his body, died 3 years later of a heroin overdose at the same age. Ed Sullivan died in 1974, never having spoken Morrison's name again after that September night. The FBI closed Morrison's file in 1972, but kept it classified until 2003. When researchers finally gained access to the documents, they found over 800 pages of surveillance reports, wiretap transcripts, and agent observations. On page 17 of the September 18, 1967 report, the agent named Richard Helm wrote a single assessment that would prove more accurate than Sullivan's prophecy. He wrote that James Douglas Morrison was not a criminal or a drug addict or a sexual deviant. He was something more dangerous than all of those things. He was a man who genuinely didn't fear consequences, who valued symbolic gestures over practical survival, who would rather die young than compromise his vision of truth. Helm wrote that such men were rare and unpredictable and impossible to control through normal legal means. He was right. Morrison proved uncontrollable until the end. And in proving that, he left behind something that outlasted Ed Sullivan's variety show, outlasted the FBI's surveillance apparatus, outlasted every attempt to silence or punish or domesticate him. He left behind the memory of a man who looked at America's most powerful television host and chose his own words over his own career. Whether that was wisdom or madness remains debatable. But 57 years later, we're still talking about it. And nobody remembers what Ed Sullivan said that night.